He's the bully on the block, and until you knock him down, he will keep pushing you.
Vladimir Putin's on the warpath. He's annexed the Crimea and unleashed a civil war on the edge of Europe, causing thousands of deaths.
We are having a very dangerous player on the global stage.
War moved one step closer when flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine, leaving 298 innocent civilians dead, bringing outrage in the West and prompting defiance from the East.
Did they look each other in the eyes one final time in a wordless goodbye? We will never know.
The West shares responsibility for what has happened.
You in the West, you don't understand whom are you dealing with.
Для защиты нашей свободы у нас хватит и сил, и воли, и мужества.
Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, 700 kilometers west from the front line, where the Ukrainian army is fighting against pro-Russian separatists. Alexander Lapko lives in the suburbs here with his mother. They offer a warm welcome. Coffee, cake, small talk, a brief distraction from larger concerns. Alexander's worried he should be in the army, helping to fight against the enemy in the east.
You know, I think that this war is nonsense, and there is no reasons. It's the most unreasonable war. There is nothing to fight for.
But on the Ukrainian side, they probably say they're dying for the country.
Yeah, they are. They are dying for the country. And yeah, it's really, these are questions you can't, it's not really an easy one.
But there are men who, unlike Alexander, want to fight. They can join the so-called Azov Regiment, a paramilitary unit consisting entirely of volunteers.
И сколько людей приходят сюда, чтобы записаться в полк Азов?
Ну, в среднем около сотни человек в месяц набирается. Тут уже у нас кадровая служба работает, смотрит на людей. Ну, я так понимаю, там адекватных людей отбирают, а неадекватных отсеивают, а в целом на какие-то военные навыки или профессиональные способности это особое значение не имеет. Главное, чтобы человек хотел защищать свою родину и был адекватным.
The Azov Regiment is controversial. Some members have been accused of extreme right-wing sympathies. But in times of war, motives matter less than results. In the eastern Ukraine, members of this corps are fighting side by side with soldiers of the government army.
В последнее время вы расширились, и насколько, какие обязанности у полка Азов в зоне АТО?
Получается, охрана Мариуполя, зачистка городов. Ну, в том случае, когда какой-то очередной город берут, наш полк участвует в зачистке.
These pictures are all of volunteers killed fighting against the separatists. Alexander Lapko fears that he too may have to go to the front.
Hello?
His brother Yura is already in a war zone and regularly calls home.
Ну, рассказывай, как там ты? Что там?
Смотри, если не слышно вот шума этого...
Тебя прекрасно слышно, прекрасно слышно.
То счастье обстреливают, то еще что-то, они там рядом со счастьем.
Да, понятно.
Вот.
Ясно, ясно.
Сегодня вот слышал в новостях, что стреляли с той стороны, ну, то есть из-за границы.
Mm-hmm. Shoot it from Russia. Today.
Да, да.
But soldiers like Alexander's brother are not just threatened by war violence. The Ukrainian army is plagued by corruption. And often, the money designated for troop equipment has disappeared. This leaves the families of fighters facing tough choices.
The uniform we bought like used second-hand NATO uniform. We don't know which nation. And the rest of equipment, we had a good deal on body armor and the helmet.
Where does one buy body armor?
Yeah, I don't know
Well, you did.
Well, my mom did this. Yeah, and as for helmet, I only know that it's Israeli, and the body armor is Ukrainian. But all of this is really costly. And for the average family, it's, I wouldn't say next to impossible. If it's about your life, you will find a way. But it's really complicated.
The Azov regiment is also responsible for its own finances. According to one volunteer, the corps receives hardly any financial support from the government and is highly dependent on donations.
Мы помогаем им, чем можем. Собираем деньги на генераторы, на теплое белье, зимние ботинки, так как в нашей стране пока правительство и держава этим очень слабо занимается. Поэтому все держится на плечах волонтеров, на плечах действительно патриотов и людей, которые любят свою родину. Допустим, вот недавно мы привезли буквально 100 килограмм смальца, который сейчас в зимнее время необходим бойцам для того, чтобы что-то приготовить, что-то пожарить или даже в лечебных целях.
On the edge of Europe, Ukraine is at war with pro-Russian separatists. 4,300 people have already died. And according to the United Nations, this number is growing by 13 deaths every day. Ukraine increasingly appears to be fighting against Russia directly. The question is, what is the agenda of the man some argue is most responsible for this conflict?
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
May the 7th, 2012, the Kremlin. This is the inauguration of Vladimir Putin, President of Russia. He's beginning his third term as head of state, a unique achievement in Russian history. Putin looks relaxed. But the president is not without worries. The day before, tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Moscow in a mass demonstration against the inauguration. One of the protesters is Misha Kashenko.
Но он туда пошел, потому что считал, что как раз вот результаты президентских выборов были сфальсифицированы.
The protests begin peacefully. But as more people arrive at Bolotnaya Square, the demonstration becomes chaotic. This is not a common scene in Putin's Russia. Riot police are forced to intervene. His sister explains how Misha Kashenko became involved in the clashes.
Там была такая ситуация, когда группа полицейских из 3 человек врезается в толпу и пытается вырвать одного из участников. И он оказался рядом с тем местом. И когда полицейские схватили человека, они пытались его вырвать. То есть он как бы пытался удержать этого человека, чтобы ему это удалось. А полицейский отошел, и потом группа людей начала избивать этого полицейского.
Сам он не избивал?
Нет.
According to his sister, Misha didn't use any violence. She is receiving support from Amnesty International. The human rights organization studied the images and is convinced of Kashenko's innocence.
I saw the video footage. It's amazing that someone is standing there absolutely peaceful and quiet in spite of the fact that there's kind of fighting around him.
The demonstrations against Putin appear to have few immediate consequences for Misha, but a month after the riot, he was arrested.
I think it was meant as a signal because there were quite well-known dissenters, protesters there in the crowd. They could be easily chosen by law enforcement agencies. They could be taken to the court, but it didn't happen. Generally speaking, it was unknown people, just ordinary people who happened to be there. They were chosen, they were taken, and to me it looks like a message to the whole society. You know, you could be there, you could be on his place or on her place.
In October 2013, Misha Kashenko was sentenced. Human rights organizations speak of a show trial. According to his sister, the authorities exploited her brother's illness. Misha suffers from a mild form of schizophrenia. The judge sentenced him to forced hospitalization in a psychiatric institution. Since June this year, Kashenko has been free. But he is still forced to visit a psychiatrist every month.
Как он рассказывал при первой встрече с этим врачом, когда он пришел с бумагами из больницы, что он на принудительном лечении, но амбулаторно, доктор ему сказал: моя задача сделать так, чтобы ты не перестал ходить на митинги. Вот вам психиатрия. Как была советская, так вот стала российская. Ничего не поменялось.
The protests on Bolotnaya Square did nothing to prevent the inauguration of Vladimir Putin as new head of state 1 day later. Yet the mass protest did have an effect on Putin. According to an author of several Putin biographies, the public dissatisfaction was to radically change his political course.
Before Bolotnaya, before the protests, Putin based his role on one premise. We are together with Europe. We are moving towards Europe. We are imitating democratic institutions. Now he's basing his role on another premise. Europe and the West are enemies, and we are going to contain the West everywhere, not only in Russia. And we are going to expand our traditional values around the globe.
Why this change of course?
Change of course because he apparently understood that if he leaves these people, Bolotnaya people, a bit of freedom, half-open window, they will demand more. And he didn't want to give them anything. Because if you give them one finger, they will tear off the whole hand. So he decided just to change the paradigm and return to the old Soviet times. To the old Soviet times, subjugate the society, close the doors, close the windows, and consolidate the society on the basis of the enemy. Besieged fortress. This is the Russian invention. Nothing new.
Putin has encouraged an old-fashioned Russian idea as part of a plan to keep him in power for years. It's about the contrast between us and them. Russia versus the rest of the world. And it's a story that requires a strong leader. The new message is spread through the familiar medium of television. Critics say the major stations in Russia are strictly controlled by the Kremlin. But at smaller stations, some criticism is still possible.
Dozhd is a very small and independent channel, but was a very high impact.
Sergei Medvedev has his own show on TV Dozhd, but he doesn't attract many viewers. The programs being produced here have not been broadcast by Russian national TV since the beginning of the year. The station believes it has been banned from the airwaves under false pretenses. Now, the station can only be seen on the internet and attracts a small, select audience.
With us, you have to go online, you have to install smart TV, you have, to buy the subscription. And I would say a very, very top of, urban middle class is doing this. And in a sense, I would say we're preaching to the choir, because anyway, we are with the same crowd that, went out there to protest on Bolotnaya Square.
As the channels critical of the regime move to the internet, remaining broadcast TV stations continue to toe the official Kremlin line. The president's message is broadcast to the people night after night.
Just imagine an average Russian person living in a small village. They have an aerial, and what they receive, 2-3 channels. These are pro-Kremlin channels, no criticism whatsoever, and it's sometimes 100% on how bad things are in Ukraine and how bad things are in Western Europe and the United States. So it reminds me of good old Soviet days when we had news like that.
You'll see totally Orwellian propaganda. A lot of lies, half-truth, used to justify one thing. Russia is surrounded by enemies. Russia is being constantly cheated, humiliated by those Western guys. You cannot trust anyone. And the only salvation is to fight, to consolidate around the flag, and to consolidate around our president.
And the state's message is beginning to filter onto the streets of Moscow. Meet the proud grandmother of patriotic 7-year-old Sasha.
Я говорю, ты всех, Сашенька, любишь? Всех, особенно свою любимую Россию. Россия очень хорошая страна, она никогда никому зла не желает. Я говорю, правильно, Сашуля. У нас миролюбивый народ, но нас почему-то не любят. Я говорю, многие. А почему не любят? Он, бабушка, а почему? А я говорю, потому что у нас большая страна, богатство. У нас, начиная от золота, кончая углем, нефтем, у нас все есть. А все американцы хотят у нас, чтобы нас завоевать. Я говорю, ну не получится. Бабушка, ни за что. Ни за что. Вот такой вот мальчишка растет. Патриот страшный. Просто патриот. И, знаете, удивительный прям просто парень. Честно слово.
Maidan Square in Kiev is covered in pictures of men who died in early 2014. During the uprising that led to the departure of the pro-Russian president, Yanukovych. Mustafa Naim was one of the first protesters.
This guy died first. He died not here, but he died on Grushevska Street. And it was in January.
How did he die?
Just people was attacking barricades and someone fired 2 bullets. As I remember, one bullet was in his neck and the other in his heart, and he died.
The protests began peacefully. People headed to Maidan Square after the president decided that provisionally the Ukraine would not join the European Union. The protesters disagree with President Yanukovych, who seems to be influenced by pressure from Putin. He wants to keep Ukraine within the Russian sphere of influence, and that means no integration with Europe. That's when Mustafa Naim posted a call to action on Facebook.
My post actually was, if you're really ready to do something, just put some comments on this post that you're really ready. And in 1 hour, more than 600 or 800 people said that they want to do something. And approximately it was 8 o'clock p.m. I posted that, okay, let's meet there. I mean, I didn't expect that people will come because that day was very cold, it was rainy.
What begins as a Facebook action grows into a massive protest. The demonstrations will last for months. And when the eyes of the world are focused on Kiev, Western politicians also find their way to the square.
Ik heb net met een stel jonge mensen gesproken en ik vroeg, wat willen jullie nou eigenlijk? En het hele simpele antwoord is, leven zoals jullie.
Never ever give up. We are with you, we don't go, we stay with you.
Ми з вами, ми не йдемо, ми залишаємось.
Long live a democratic Ukraine. Thank you.
Ik denk ook, zij zijn vol zelfvertrouwen. Ze zeggen, er komen steeds meer mensen naar dit plein. Er komen steeds meer mensen die duidelijk gaan maken dat onze regering een Europese keuze moet maken. Ik vind dat mooi.
The provocative images of Western politicians on Russia's doorstep were viewed with suspicion in Moscow.
Well, it was a mistake, obviously. It was at that point. I mean, the Russians are very suspicious of what they see as Western efforts to humiliate and encircle them.
Tony Brenton now teaches at the University of Cambridge. From 2004 to 2008, he was the British ambassador in Moscow. At that time, Brenton had regular personal contact with Putin. The diplomat feels he understands Russia's suspicion of the West.
So when these demonstrations got going, and then Western politicians came down there and supported the demonstrations, what they saw, in their suspicious way, was a concerted Western attempt to seize control of a country which they had viewed as being very much part of their own sphere of influence.
According to Brenton, Putin can hardly be blamed for seeing the hand of the West in the protests in Kiev.
Let me give one small example, which is Victoria Nuland, the US official who has been responsible for all this in the State Department, went down to the Maidan, made a very famous telephone call on an open line where she did one thing, which was roundly abuse the EU's supposed ineffectiveness, you will recall.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it and, you know, fuck the EU.
The other thing she did was said, we want the following people in the Ukrainian government, the new Ukrainian government which is coming.
So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy.
She named, in particular, Yatsenyuk as Prime Minister. Then, a week later, Yatsenyuk as Prime Minister. What are the Russians, with their very suspicious mindset, bound to conclude, other than this whole thing is manipulated by the CIA on behalf of the Americans?
American influence or not, what begins as a peaceful protest ends in a bloody confrontation that has its origins in pent-up frustration among the population. The demonstrators are fed up with years of corruption and self-enrichment of the political elite. What starts with a message on Facebook ends in a battle with 100 deaths. At the end of February 2014, the political crisis ends. The Ukrainian parliament approves the deposition of President Yanukovych. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin knows that he is likely to lose his grip on Ukraine.
He and his immediate circle genuinely feared that they were looking at a Western-driven takeover of Ukraine, and in a sense panicked and said, well, what can we rescue from this mess? And the obvious thing was the naval base in Sevastopol and Crimea, and therefore they took the steps which led to the annexation of Crimea.
A few days after the revolution in Kiev, Russian military forces seized power in the Crimea, the southern peninsula of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin denies any involvement, but is satisfied as he speaks to the Russian parliament a few weeks later.
Уважаемые друзья, сегодня мы собрались по вопросу, который имеет жизненно важное значение, историческое значение для всех нас. 17 марта в Крыму состоялся референдум. Он прошел в полном соответствии с демократическими процедурами и международно-правовыми нормами. В голосовании приняло участие более 82% избирателей. Более 96% высказалось за воссоединение с Россией. Цифры предельно убедительны.
Applause for the president, who claims that he has only acted on the will of the Crimean people. But in reality, according to Lilia Shevtsova, the annexation is about a very different point in Putin's agenda.
First of all, to consolidate Russians around him and the idea of defending Russians, you know, and building the Russian world. And it worked, because annexation of Crimea brought him 88% of approval rating. And annexation of Crimea allowed him to shift Russia into absolutely new model of survival as a war country, and he became a war president.
The annexation of Crimea, the conflict with the West. Vladimir Putin is using it mainly to strengthen his domestic political position. Putin thinks the citizens of a threatened nation seek support and safety in their leader, instead of asking difficult questions. The president is very clear.
Некоторые западные политики уже стращают нас не только санкциями, но и перспективой обострения внутренних проблем. Хотелось бы знать, что они имеют в виду. Действия некой пятой колонны, разного рода национал-предателей, или рассчитывают, что смогут ухудшить социально-экономическое положение России и тем самым спровоцировать недовольство людей.
Andrei Zubov is seen by Putin as a traitor. He's an historian who has sharply criticized the annexation of the Crimea.
I immediately saw the parallels with the behavior of Nazi Germany in surrounding countries with German population.
На Украине живут и будут жить миллионы русских людей, русскоязычных граждан. И Россия всегда будет защищать их интересы политическими, дипломатическими, правовыми средствами.
It's the same reasoning, said Zubov, that was used by Hitler when he annexed Austria and the Sudetenland.
In all these places, the German population was predominant. And because of Nazi propaganda, many German people in these regions wanted to be unified, to be in one state with Germany. There were special parties, special movements, and in March 1938, Hitler decided to start this process of unification of all German populated lands.
The professor published his criticism on the internet. A few days later, he's called to the board of the university where he works, which falls directly under the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
My head of my chair in philosophy told me that I ought to resign from my state of professor of the university because I made immoral step, immoral activity.
Zubov was fired thanks to his criticism of President Putin. He says he gets support from colleagues, some of them even resigning out of protest. But in the eyes of others, Zubov has become a leper.
Even some of my friends, colleagues and friends, they stopped to phone me, stopped to write me, and when I met them on some obligations in somewhere in conferences, they prefer not to express even that they are acquainted with me. They're afraid. They remember Soviet times when these dissidents, people who were against regime, were almost untouchable persons.
Pariahs.
Yes, pariahs, yes. And they decided that now time is the same. But there is another reason. Many of them think in the depths of their heart just as I did. And they, since they are specialists in foreign relations, international relations, in international law, they understand very well that Putin did a very bad thing for Russia. But they were afraid to express it, and I didn't afraid. And so they hated me because I did the things they didn't done.
Who can challenge Putin's authority? The Russians themselves, the West, or maybe Ukraine? The country seems to stand alone. It wants weapons, but the West refuses to deliver them. Support for Ukraine is limited to economic sanctions against Moscow.
I think Ukraine needs to realize that no one's going to come rescue them.
Robert Bench is a US gas trader who's lived and worked in Ukraine for years. According to Bench, Europe doesn't care about Ukraine. And the sanctions, those were only imposed because there was nothing else to be done.
And they were forced upon Europe because of the airline that went down. If not for that airline going down, the calculus within Ukraine would be different. The sanctions would be different. What made people care about Ukraine after Crimea and to this day forward is that airline going down. Without that airline going down, there aren't additional sanctions.
The American repeats what we have often heard during our trip in Ukraine. The MH17 disaster was terrible, but was the best thing that could have happened in Ukraine, because it turned the West into an ally in the fight against Putin. It's a controversial opinion, and it's questionable what difference it will really make to Putin.
The brutal fact is that on their core objective, which is changing Russia's political course, they have failed. And this is unsurprising. We in the West have imposed sanctions on Russia 6 times since the end of the Second World War, and they've never worked. The Russian response to that sort of external pressure is always to gather the wagons and stand tough.
So why do we impose the sanctions? Gallery play?
Yeah, politicians have to be seen to, quote, do something, unquote, and sanctions is all they've got.
Time will tell whether the sanctions will have effect. The fact is that the economic outlook is poor. The ruble is under pressure. The price of oil, which is very important for the Russian economy, is decreasing. But this will probably not stop Putin.
A lot of people distrust Mr. Putin. Even more people in Moscow loathe Mr. Putin. And at the same time, they do approve, they do support his activity. Why? Because they're afraid of chaos. They're afraid that if Putin collapses, if Putin goes down in flames, the state will unravel, which is a possibility.
In Kiev, the fall of Putin would be greeted with cheers. Certainly by Alexander Lapko and his mother, who hope the war will come to an end as quickly as possible.
How's this war going to end?
And when? Well, Ukraine will win, that's for sure, but I don't know when. And how many lives it will take.
What makes you so sure Ukraine will win?
Because good guys always win.